Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we'll be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This episode begins a new mini-series for the podcast, in which we are going to be looking at some of the most consequential strikes of the last century. And really what's prompted us to think about this is the biggest of all strikes, in many respects, the general strike, which took place 100 years ago this very month. As this is such a big topic, and as there's so much to discuss, to really put us into the context of the time and to understand the scale and the severity of what was taking place, we've decided for the first time to do this over 2 episodes. So in this first episode, we'll be talking about the causes of the strike, the testy relations between the miners, the mine owners, the government, the trade unions and others, and how the strike begins and the scale of it, before next time we look at more about how the strike unfolds, how it's managed and how it comes to an end. And Richard, to kick us off, one of the things that's going to really recur as a theme in the weeks ahead is coal, and coal mining in particular. Really, it's been at the heart of Britain's great success in the Victorian era, much of which through the Industrial Revolution was powered by coal. And then it's the cause of much of the industrial strife that we see in Britain in the 20th century. At least that is, of course, right up until the miners' strike of the mid-1980s. To begin this episode on the general strike of 1926, why don't you begin by setting out for us what the coal mining industry was like in Britain a century ago?
Well, to begin, it's a rather obvious point, but coal was the fuel that brought Britain its great industrial success in the 19th and early 20th century. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. And coal mining was, in many respects, a uniquely important industry for the purposes of British production, and also a uniquely dangerous industry from the perspective of the workers. It really was a very, very difficult job. Just to give you a sort of sense of the dangers and the conditions of mining, some of these mines were so hot that miners would strip down naked and work all day with nothing but their knee pads as they pulled coal trolleys along narrow passages on all fours. Lives were at stake. This was an extremely dangerous job, and many miners perished down the pits. Some of the ones that stand out as the most devastating: in 1866, in the Oaks Colliery in South Yorkshire near Barnsley, over 360 miners died in an explosion. In the Albion Colliery in South Wales near Pontypridd, there was an explosion in 1894 which killed 295. The biggest mine disaster took place in 1913, so thinking just 13 years before the general strike, in Stanley in South Wales near Caerphilly, where 439 miners were killed. And when we talk about miners, we're not just talking about men, although at this time, 1 in 10 men in Britain of working age worked in a mine. So you get a sense of the scale of the industry. But we're also talking about people we would certainly consider today as children, teenagers working down the mines. The youngest to die in that disaster in St. Hitth was just 14 years old. You know, when I read about these stories, I mean, I don't have any particular personal connection to the mines, but I just feel so emotional reading about them, where you think in many cases it was too dangerous to collect their bodies, and their bodies were just left entombed in the pits. In preparation for this podcast, I sort of got down a tragic wormhole of reading about mining disasters, and I was reading about one in Whitehaven at the Wellington Pit disaster in 1910, so just 16 years before the general strike, when 136 men and boys died. And the piece that I was reading about it pointed out that in that one instant, Whitehaven had 86 new widows. 260 children in Whitehaven lost a father. And sometimes it was fathers and sons who died in the mines. One example that they gave in this piece was a miner called Tom McAllister, who was killed in that disaster with his two teenage boys. Back home, he had 6 more children, and his wife suddenly became a widow, losing 2 of her sons and her husband. And you just think about this is happening again and again. On average, 3 miners died every day in the industry. The question of safety and the conditions in the mines and the amount of time that miners were expected to work, which is in effect also tied with safety because most mining accidents happened at the end of the working day when miners were quite exhausted, became an enormous part of the bargaining that the miners' unions were involved with in the early 20th century. The leader of the Miners' Federation at the time of the general strike, Herbert Smith, obviously made his career as a miner, but then he transitioned into being part of rescue efforts, and that became his specialty. And so he was there in Whitehaven at that mining disaster, and he was only able to save 7 miners out alive, and 136 died. And those kinds of stories really weighed on the trade union leaders because it was their experience when they went out to bargain for their members. So this is not a group of workers who are, to take sort of modern anti-union stereotypes, sort of soft, comfortable workers who are trying to squeeze out an even better, luxurious living. This was very dangerous work. These people were not paid particularly well. And the conditions that they endured to do their job were very, very tough indeed. And I think, and we'll probably talk about this in this episode, as a baseline, I think they had very widespread public sympathy because of the nature of their work. And when you had figures like Winston Churchill, who in 1910 set the army on the Tonypandy miners in South Wales, who were on strike, and he sent the army with their bayonets charging at pickets outside a mine to get them back to work. That really offended people across the country. And I can remember my grandmother, who was a little girl at the time of the general strike. She was 5 years old at the time of the general strike. She always had a particular dislike for Winston Churchill because of what she viewed as what he did to the miners at the time of the general strike, which we'll get onto, but also before she was born, decade before she was born, when he was Home Secretary as a Liberal and set the army on the miners.
So I think you've set out very clearly there the size and scale of the industry and also the poor conditions that many of the people working in it faced. Of course, it wasn't just something that they took lying down. And I think there were 2 things which we ought to bear in mind, which is relevant to the general strike. The first is that there was a history of industrial action as a means of securing better conditions and better terms for the mine workers. Secondly, that the Mine Workers Federation wasn't working in isolation in terms of its industrial action, that this triple alliance existed between the mine workers, but also the railwaymen and transport workers more generally, where they would basically support one another with strike action if any of them felt that they would need to go out onto the picket. Now, it was one of those things that was, you could perhaps say, truest in the breach rather than the observance, the Triple Alliance. But there was this principle of solidarity between multiple trade unions going into this.
So to move this forward, in the context of these absolutely catastrophic mining disasters where hundreds and hundreds of men and boys were dying down the pits, there was push for the government to better regulate the mining industry. And some of this began just before the Second World War, although there had been Victorian legislation as well, I should say. But to enhance legislation came about first in 1912, when the government legislated for a national wage board so that miners could collectively bargain on a national level. So this wasn't to nationalize the mines, but it was to get the agreement of the mine workers that they would recognize a kind of national scale for miners' compensation. And so one of these happens before the First World War in 1912, with the coal miners Minimum Wage Act, which sets up regional boards where there is negotiation done at a regional level to represent the mines. But it becomes a sort of first quasi-national framework for a standard wage for miners across the country. And then during the First World War, the national government becomes even more involved in the mines because of the essential nature of coal for the war effort. And then after the war, the government starts to take a step back. But there is a desire among miners not to go back to the way things were, that the conditions had improved, that pay had improved in the First World War, and that they saw that government involvement in the industry was the way to improve conditions for miners. And so after threats of strikes in 1919, the coalition government, which at that time was led by the Liberal Lloyd George, but was mostly supported by the Conservatives, predominantly Conservative in its composition, passed the Coal Industry Commission Act. And this set up the Sankey Commission. And the Sankey Commission was led by a really remarkable individual, John Sankey. He was a grocer's son, rather than like Margaret Thatcher Grocer's daughter, whose father died when he was just a boy, when he was just 8 years old. Thanks to the Anglican Church, he was given a scholarship and had a very good education at a public school, Lancing College in Sussex, and then went on to Oxford. And Sankey was a man of the left, for sure. He was someone who had made his career representing miners and other workers in workmen's compensation cases. He had practiced in South Wales, so most of his clients had been miners. He was really rather good at it. He was made a KC. And the Sankey report is really significant because Sankey says in the report, quote, "The present system of ownership and working in the coal industry stands condemned, and some other system must be substituted for it. Either nationalization or a method of unification by national purchase and or by joint control." So he puts on the table nationalization and dares the coalition government to consider it. The government ignores the call for nationalization. It takes up some of his recommendations, including one of his recommendations was to create a minister for the mines. The government goes ahead and does that. However, the government appoints as the Minister for the Mines not someone of a particularly sympathetic background to the miners, but an old Etonian called William Bridgeman, who was a fierce opponent of miners' rights, of socialism, of syndicalism, and basically used his position to defend the rights of mine owners rather than the miners, which was not exactly what John Sankey had in mind.
The Sankey Commission is important context, of course, for several reasons. One, because of what it recommends, but also, I think, because it is one of several ties between the mining industry and the government. Because you could look at this on the face of it and say that, well, the mines by this stage are in private hands, again, after being nationalised in the First World War, and that the employees of these private companies have got the dispute. And therefore, what is that necessarily to do with the government? But the scale of the mining industry, plus things like the Sankey Commission, plus the government's recent interventions in the sector, I think really show how government cannot avoid but be embroiled in what's going on. Another of those reasons is that many people blame the government, at least in part, for the situation that the mining industry finds itself in particular, the uncompetitive state of British coal as an export. And that's because of the gold standard.
Yes, so when we think about what contributed to the general strike, we have to put the figure of Winston Churchill squarely in centre frame. Churchill is appointed Chancellor by Stanley Baldwin after the fall of the Labour government, the first Labour government, at the end of 1924. And this comes as a surprise to many, including Churchill himself. Indeed, I think the story goes that when Churchill was told by Baldwin that he was going to invite him to the cabinet to make him Chancellor, Churchill assumed Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, but then Baldwin had to say, no, Chancellor of the Exchequer, second most important figure in the government after me. One of the reasons why this was seen as a somewhat eccentric choice on Baldwin's part was because Churchill was not even a Conservative at that time. Churchill had been a Liberal MP from 1906. He'd started off as Conservative, but he quickly became a Liberal, and he was a Liberal MP from 1906 until he lost his seat in 1922. And he'd been a Liberal minister, he'd been a Liberal Home Secretary, as I mentioned, when he set the army on the miners. He got back into Parliament as a sort of quasi-independent. He stood as a constitutionalist. That can be interpreted in many ways. And so before he's even readmitted to the Conservative Party, after a 2-decade-plus absence, Stanley Baldwin makes him Chancellor. And in his first budget in April of 1925, Churchill puts Britain back on the gold standard, which it had departed from in the First World War, at the pre-First World War rate, which was $4.68. And this was widely seen as an overvaluation of the pound. It led to the famous economist John Maynard Keynes writing The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill. The move was economically disastrous. Why? Because when you have an overvalued currency, as we saw when Britain was pegged to the Deutschmark under the exchange rate mechanism in the 1980s, 1990s, then pegging it, you don't have as much flexibility. But also, if you're overvalued and pegged, that's doubly disastrous. It means that the things that you produce in your country become more expensive for foreign markets to buy, and the imports from foreign markets in relative terms are cheaper. And so that has a destructive effect on your own domestic production. And this means that coal is being very, very badly hit. In addition to that, the geopolitical situation, and we can't blame Churchill for this, we can blame Ramsay MacDonald for this. German coal becomes cheaper for Germany to export to Britain because of what was called the Dawes Plan, which was an American initiative, but made to work basically by the diplomacy of Ramsay MacDonald, who in that first Labour government in 1924 was not just Prime Minister, but he was also appointed himself his own Foreign Secretary. And where there were achievements in that government outside the field of housing and the domestic realm, it was in the foreign policy realm. But when you secure a lasting settlement in Germany that allows Germany to export its coal again, well, actually that isn't great for British coal mines because now they have a greater competition. And so all of this situation with German coal being put back on the gold standard means that in order for the mines to remain competitive, the mine owners say, we've got to cut the wages of our workers and we've got to make them work for even longer hours.
It is easy to cast Churchill as at least one of the villains of the piece. But we shouldn't forget that currency valuations are in and of themselves tricky things. There's not just economic considerations underpinning them. There's also questions of politics and questions of national pride. Certainly that was something we see in the ERM case as well. And if we think most recently about when there was a great hullabaloo when sterling was falling against the dollar during Liz Truss's brief period of misrule, people did not cheer for the falling value of the pound because our exports would suddenly become more competitive. We ought not make out that it's always good to have a cheap currency because it boosts your exports. Among other things, it makes importing much harder. And if you have things that you are required to buy off the international market, then in many ways having a stronger currency is all to the good. But it's a complicated issue, and I don't want to relitigate the decision to go into the gold standard, but it is certainly not quite as clear-cut as can sometimes be made out.
But there was great clarity from the perspective of the union leaders, and the trade union leader Ben Tillett said of Churchill that he had, quote, neither soul, conscience, honour, or anything else. He has been responsible for a greater loss in blood and treasure than any man in this country.
Of course, the coal industry is having these problems in the mid-1920s. And for reasons that we've discussed, the government is intimately connected to the situation. And in 1925, it in fact decides that it has to intervene in order to keep the coal miners at work.
Well, yes, this is a direct consequence of its own policies. So by June of 1925, the mine owners say that the nationally agreed wage scale is unsustainable, and that they will unilaterally cut wages and impose longer working conditions, and they will stage what is called a lockout. So basically they say to their workers, we're not negotiating with you on this. If you want to continue working at this company, you have to accept these changes in your conditions. And it's either you agree to work for less money and for longer hours, or you don't work here at all. You're sacked. And that was what the coal owners announced in June of 1925, and said that this would be coming into effect the following month. So then people look to the government to see, look, you created a great deal of this mess. Can you sort it out? Stanley Baldwin says on the 29th of July 1925 that the government is not going to intervene on this. And then just 2 days later, he does a U-turn and says the government will intervene for 9 months. It will subsidize the different mines so that they can maintain the previously agreed national pay scale. And alongside that, within that 9-month period, Stanley Baldwin says that he would invite Sir Herbert Samuel, who was a prominent Liberal. He'd actually just spent 5 years as the British High Commissioner in the Palestine Mandate, the first British leader in Palestine after the League of Nations gave Britain that mandate for that area, obviously an area of great contention. Herbert Samuel was a committed Zionist and a Jew. Samuel would go on to become leader of the Liberal Party in the 1930s. He was seen as a sort of eminent statesman and seen as someone who was not of an especially right-wing disposition. So in classic Baldwin style, kind of fairly conciliatory figure. And Samuel was asked to draw up a new settlement to get us out of this mess, basically. And so you then basically see a 9-month race between the government and the trades unions to prepare for what both of them anticipate could be a strike further down the line. If the Samuel Commission report goes the way of the Sankey Commission report, i.e. it doesn't actually lead to fundamental change and a sustainable long-term settlement, then there will be a strike. And Baldwin later claimed the reason that he did capitulate in the July on the wage question was because simply the government wasn't ready, and he wanted to use that time to get the government ready.
We'll reflect as we get to the end of this mini-series a little bit on what are the key points on which the fate of these strikes tends to be decided. But clearly one of them is, to what extent is the government prepared for them? And that's what Baldwin is talking about in 25. It's why, among other things, the subsidy is 9 months, because it takes it to early summer, when, of course, coal is much more important in the winter than in the summer. And if you line up the moment of confrontation and jeopardy for April, then you at least begin by giving yourself a bit of a card in the deck that you can play more effectively, as opposed to the mine workers, who would probably much rather the prospect of a strike in November in terms of maximising their own position. So what I think we see beginning to build up here, and in fact it's been going on really with a lot of contingency work for years, is Baldwin and the government preparing for a big showdown with the unions, and particularly with the Mine Workers Federation. They're seeing the problem, they're understanding the risk of a strike, general, national or otherwise, and they're preparing themselves for it. As part of this dynamic where you've got the Mine Workers Federation and the mine owners, and then the government, and then the TUC, or the Trade Union Congress, with its General Council. So as the tensions are rising, Richard, and the government is getting prepared, who's playing the crucial role in determining whether or not this escalates to the point of a mass national walkout?
Well, we get to the spring of 1926, and Sir Herbert Samuel releases his report, and he proposes chiefly that the previous system of national bargaining over miners' pay resumes, that the mine owners commit to a 7-hour working day, because anything longer increases exponentially the risks of accidents that can lead to deaths. And Sir Herbert Samuel proposes a 13.5% pay cut. So the unions are happy with the first two. They're happy with national bargaining. They're happy with the 7-hour working day. They're obviously not happy with the pay cut, and the mine owners take the opposite view, which is that they are not happy with national bargaining, they're not happy with a 7-hour day, but they are happy with pay cuts.
It is worth saying I don't want to pitch myself in the unpopular position of being the mine owner's defender, but of course part of the reason why they would object to national pay bargaining for the sector is that all over the country, mines have varying levels of profitability. In fact, at this time, paying out what they had been, they'd be running at a loss. And that's partly because some coal seams are incredibly rich and lucrative, and some are a bit older, a bit more knackered, a bit more exploited, to the point that there's not that much coal there left, or it's not that easy to access. So there is a sound basis for objecting to treating a fragmented industry, really, as if it's a national one in terms of pay scales.
Yes, I mean, I don't profess to be an expert on the mining industry, but at that time there were about 2,000 pits, and something like 90% of coal was mined in a quarter of those pits. Part of that is, as Lee said, as a pit is used more and more, not only is it that there may be less coal, but actually you have to go deeper and deeper. It takes longer to get the coal. So it becomes, and this is why the matter of hours from the perspective of the employers was something they cared a lot about, was because they wanted to ensure that they could get the miners down there and that they could actually get to the pits. And one of the things that the unions used to get very angry about was that time that it took was often uncompensated time for the miners, and that was a whole other side of the dispute.
That is very graphically described, for example, in The Road to Wigan Pier, in a slightly different context. I mean, it's a traumatic thing to do. It's traumatic even to read about, really, even all these decades on.
And so what happens is the 9 months come to an end on the 30th of April, 1926. There are negotiations that are being carried on, and government is involved in these negotiations because of the importance of this industry and seeing if there can be a government-led solution on this. But the mine workers are being locked out by their employees already. So already the miners are not able to go back to work. And there's growing speculation that some of the other industries may come out in sympathy with the miners to put more pressure on the government and on the representatives of the pit owners to come to a compromise around the Samuel report. However, and also showing something of the accelerating intensity of this situation, on the day that the government subsidy runs out, the government then invokes, through the King, through George V, the emergency powers under the Emergency Powers Act 1920, which basically gives, and we'll talk about this in a moment, which gives the government these extraordinary powers of control over the economy and civil liberties and commandeering the army for domestic purposes. And then on the night of the 3rd of May, 1926, the Daily Mail is going to run a front page story which is highly critical of the mine workers, critical of the unions, critical of other workers who are planning to put the pressure on the government to come to a compromise. The print workers of the Daily Mail refused to print this issue. And the editor of the Daily Mail rings up the Home Secretary, a man called William Joynson Hicks, Jicks, who is known by his nickname, and says, "This is absolutely outrageous. You've got to do something about it. These printers are going to foment revolution or what have you." And it's at that point that Stanley Baldwin has to convene an emergency cabinet meeting. This is, we're talking about just about midnight now, between the night of the 3rd and the 4th of May. The cabinet tells Baldwin, and that's the way Baldwin puts it, the cabinet basically instructs him to end the negotiations, to call it off. We can't work with these people if they're not even going to, if they're now infringing on freedom of the press. As a little side note, someone in Downing Street has the foresight to contact Windsor Castle, where the king is sleeping at this time, as all of this is going on, to alert the king's household that he won't be receiving the Daily Mail tomorrow because the printers of the Daily Mail have gone on strike and are refusing to print anti-trade union propaganda from the Daily Mail. And I think rather missing the significance of what Downing Street was trying to tell them, the King's assistant private secretary said, not to worry, we don't take the Daily Mail or the Daily Express. Not understanding perhaps the significance of this. At 12:30 a.m., so we're now on to the 4th of May, Baldwin concludes this emergency cabinet meeting. He calls in the leaders of the TUC into the cabinet room in Downing Street, and he tells them about the Daily Mail incident and says that Cabinet have instructed me to break off my negotiations. And then he says to these union leaders, to all that you gentlemen have done to try and effect an honourable peace, courtesy demanded that I should tell you personally. Walter Citrine, the General Secretary of the TUC, then tried to be conciliating and said to the Prime Minister, well, this has been difficult for all of us. And then Baldwin replied, well, I have been happy to meet you, and I solemnly believe, if we live, we shall meet again to settle it. And Baldwin paused, and then emotionally repeated, if we live. And then the Prime Minister hastily left the cabinet room. Jimmy Thomas, the leader of the railway union, who'd been a cabinet minister in the previous Labour government, stood there, quote, somewhat perplexed. The union leaders then went to see the broader trade union leaders who were in the Treasury boardroom, and they read out this letter that Stanley Baldwin had given them. Ernest Bevan, who was the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, who will play a pivotal role in this strike, says, we must draft a reply to the Prime Minister straight away. And so they hastily draft a reply, and then they dart back to 10 Downing Street to give their response to the Prime Minister. But they're told by the policeman at number 10 that they're too late. The Prime Minister is asleep and he's not to be disturbed. So they just leave the letter there. They then go to the TUC headquarters by Victoria Station on Eccleston Square, and they're plotting until 3:30 in the morning. Jimmy Thomas, the railway leader, then leaves at 3:30. There's some journalists who have been waiting outside, and Thomas says that the British government has just declared war against its own people. And really, I think the TUC were in a state of shock over all of this. This response by the Daily Mail workers was not part of the plan. This was not orchestrated by the TUC. It was not instruction by the TUC. They didn't expect the government just to end the negotiations there and then. The socialist journalist Raymond Posgate later described the TUC's shock as follows. He said, it was like they were asking for an elephant or a dragon, not expecting to receive it. And then, lo, here it is, walking up the garden path. So after all this sort of threat that they were going to do a general strike, but never really expecting that they were going to need to do a general strike, here they were now needing to do a general strike.
It's fascinatingly chaotic how this seminal event in 20th century British history really gets going. And it starts with this legitimate grievance of a crucial but much put upon sector. Through the solidarity of other people within the working class and other trade unions, it sort of gains its own momentum to the point that it really becomes quite hard for the trade union leaders to really control the situation. I mean, it is remarkable that, in many ways, the trigger for the general strike itself, that really ensures it happens, isn't ordered by trade union bosses. It's a spontaneous withdrawal of their labour from the printers of the Daily Mail. There are a couple of things I wanted to just reflect on before we move on. One of them is that there is this underlying reality to the situation in the mining sector, which I think it's just worth making particularly clear. The union leaders for the miners had this slogan of not a minute on the day, not a penny off the pay. And it's a good slogan, perfectly catchy. But it doesn't come to terms with the reality of the question that mines aren't profitable. And there has to be a way of bridging the gap between what the people who work in the mines feel that they need in order to live a reasonable and dignified life and what the economic value of the work that they're doing is. Now, there were several options at that. And it could be that the mine owners went at a loss, but these are private industries. They're not going to do that. It could be government subsidy, as it has been since the summer of 1925. But Baldwin really doesn't feel like that can continue. And there are people in the Conservative Party determined to stiffen Baldwin's resolve that that does not continue. It could be miners being paid less, as of course has been recommended, but as he will not accept. And it could also be longer term improvements into the productivity of mines or some combination of all of those ideas. But the fundamental point is that if conditions are to be improved for the miners and pay protected, then somebody has to pay for that, which I just think we need to place there as the economic reality underpinning all of this. It's worth saying I have a huge deal of sympathy with striking miners, but there are two questions that I really have about it. One of them is, do they have the right to try and use general strike to cripple the country in order to advance their own interests? And the second is, which is really more material to them, is it a remotely good strategy? These are the sorts of things that I think the Miners' Federation and others in the trade union movement would have been well advised to be thinking through at the time. Some of them were. I were quite sceptical about what was going on, of course. But really, I don't see how you can think you can win the first question in the court of public opinion, that this justifies general strike, or how in practice you can see the way through to making sure that this actually materially improves the welfare of the miners. Richard, to move the story on, of course, what makes this strike so remarkable isn't the word strike, it's the word general. It's meant to be across the country. It's meant to be across industries. So how broad is the strike?
Well, this is a general strike, not an all-out strike, and I think it's important for people to understand the difference. An all-out strike, or a general all-out strike, would be a strike where you told every worker in the country to stop working. And that wasn't actually the approach of the TUC. The view of the TUC was that you would have different industries and sectors come out in waves, and that you would grow the intensity of the strike rather than start strong and then trickle off.
One of the things that I found remarkable about this, or really striking about it, is they refer to these waves as lines. So there's this kind of World War One terminology. Of course, much of the First World War, certainly on the Western Front, being trench warfare and lines of attack, an almost militaristic language that, of course, a lot of the people involved in this strike on all sides have been intimately involved in, sort of permeates a lot of the discussion and the way they think about tactics and strategy almost.
Yes, of course, and so many of the people who were out on strike had themselves served their country in the First World War and had literally experienced this firsthand. So you have, in that initial first line of the strike, the industries that are most noticeable. Obviously, there's mining and certain industries related to power and supply. There's printing, of course, which we've mentioned as the spark that sets off the inferno. But transport is a really big one. And the idea was to try to bring the country to a physical halt. And this is a time when, of course, there were private automobiles, cars, but most people did not have a car by any stretch of the imagination, right? These were things that were really out of the reach of private owners. Even middle-class people would not likely have had a car. So people were very reliant on public transport. Buses, trams, many parts of the country had public tram networks, which have subsequently in many parts of the country been torn up. I always think what a shame, for example, Cambridge. I used to have a tram that would take you from Cambridge railway station right into the old centre of Cambridge. And now it's a considerable, half an hour walk at least. And the transport strikes were very effective. In London, not one of the 3,300 London general omnibus vehicles operated on the first day of the strike. In some cases, bus drivers sabotaged their own vehicles. They poured the wrong stuff into the engine or blew up their vehicles. The train drivers played a crucial role in not driving their trains, and hardly any trains were going across the country. The dockers were another major first line sector where they were refusing to offload the shipments coming into the country, which had all kinds of knock-on consequences. In total, 141 unions that were affiliated to the TUC were in favour of the general strike. Just 3 unions opposed the general strike. The National Union of Journalists, so journalists continued to operate during the strike, but they couldn't print anything because the printers weren't printing. The Sailors Union, the leader of the Sailors Union was an eccentric right-wing liberal called Havelock Wilson, who claimed that his members needed to be balloted before there could be a determination as to whether they could go on strike, which was somewhat silly because back in the September of 1925, the TUC conference had voted democratically to empower the executive of the TUC, the General Council of the TUC, to declare a general strike. So there was already a democratic mandate for that from the previous TUC conference. And one other union, the Electrical Power Engineers Union. But other than that, there was pretty much complete sign-up from the trade union movement. Even though this was a miners' strike at its core, fundamentally this was a dispute about miners' paying conditions. It's interesting that the leader of the Transport and General Workers Union, the TGWU, Ernest Bevin, becomes the de facto leader of the strike. Bevin addresses a TUC gathering at the start of the strike in this beautiful building, Congregational Memorial Hall in Farringdon in central London, which disgracefully was demolished in the 1960s for an awful 1960s tower block, which has itself now been subsequently demolished. And he says to the union leaders, quote, "We are moving to an extraordinary position. In 24 hours from now, you may have to cease being separate unions. For this purpose, you will have to become one union with no autonomy. And the person who is going to be in charge would be," I'm now ventriloquizing a bit, "the person who'd be in charge is me." And it became a great moment in the life of Ernest Bevin, who's one of the greatest Britons to live, a far more impressive figure, I think, than Winston Churchill, even though Churchill often gets that moniker, would go on to be one of the most significant foreign secretaries in British history in the Attlee government. Bevin, coming from an impoverished background as a lorry driver, started work at the age of 10. You know, he was of the union movement, and here he comes now leading the general strike. And the irony of it was that Bevin didn't really want a general strike, but his view was if you're going to have a general strike, you do it right and you do it to win.
You mentioned there that this was, of course, a miners' strike that was boosted by mass solidarity. But of course, in many ways, it's not just that. For some of the people involved, it's also, if I use the title of David Torrance's new book on the general strike, this is the edge of revolution. This is a hugely revolutionary time, or the last decade or so, across large parts of the world. Of course, there's been the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, but there's also been the rise to power of Mussolini, for example, in Italy. And this is a pretty febrile time in international politics. And it's not particularly obvious that the United Kingdom is exempt from what seem to be these international tempests that are sometimes bringing down the old edifice of the way countries are governed. And there's certainly a feeling, at least among some in the government, that that might be the case as well, that this might, in fact, be much more than just a question about the miners. This is a question about the way in which the country is governed. That's something we'll come on to unpack much more. But the reason I mention it now is that, of course, that is one of the reasons, the scale of this and the potential consequences of defeat, why the government makes sure it's so well prepared to take on the strike. And really, it is on those preparations that so much depends.
Exactly. So over those 9 months, the government had been thinking about how would it run the country if there was a general strike. And we have to remember also, of course, that we're not that far off from the First World War, when Britain had experienced very high levels of government involvement in the management of the economy and the policing of the security of the country in perhaps a much more heavy-handed way than it would normally do in peacetime. And so it's drawing partly on that experience. So the government creates a network of 10 civil commissioners who are given emergency powers under this Emergency Powers Act from 1920 to safeguard what were called the essentials of life. And so this meant that the commissioners could order the army around to do domestic tasks that the army would normally never be dreamed of being involved in. So, for example, I mentioned that the dockers were not unloading the ships in the docks. Well, the ships were bringing food from around the world. And in London, the civil commissioner took the view that you need to get food to the people. Otherwise, we really will have revolution on our hands. And so dozens of armed vehicles, army tanks even, went to the docks to break through the dockers' pickets, to go to the ships. And remember, the shipping unions, the Merchant Navy Union, was not on strike because of this eccentric right-wing liberal leader, Havelock Wilson. They were still bringing the goods to the docks. They just couldn't get them off the ships. And so the army is taking them off the ships, putting them onto the cars, and then driving them out of the docks with guns pointing out to the dockers. Don't you dare try and stop us, because you'll be dead. And then driving through East London, down the Mile End Road where I work, into central London and out into the rest of the country with the food supplies. And apparently the working class people in these areas that they were driving through sort of stood there solemnly as they watched these military convoys with their food going through their streets. So this is an extraordinary exercise of state power. One of those commissioners was the 6th Earl Winterton, who remarked that his powers were, quote, as comprehensive as those of any head of a province in India, and also to support the army and the regular police force. In order to achieve these extraordinary acts, the government also started to recruit volunteers to act as what they called special constables.
As we come towards the end of this first episode, I think I have to disagree almost entirely with the way in which you've characterised that just then. In particular, this idea that there were working class people standing solemnly, looking on as this almost militaristic, autocratic state in the way you describe it, unloads the ships at the docks. Actually, the way I would characterise what was going on there is really rather differently. First of all, you've got a government that is not willing to let the nation starve. Yes, there were somewhere between 1 and 4 million people out on strike, but this is a country of about 40 million people, and the government has a duty to all of them. And one of the duties that it has is to try and make sure that basically people do not starve in the streets because there's been a walkout on the railways or the Transport General workers. So that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Secondly, there may have been working class people looking on, but there were also working class people driving the cars and driving the buses. I mean, in many ways, for me, the most remarkable thing about the general strike isn't the admittedly remarkable scale of the strike or the solidarity of the strikers. It's the volunteers. It's people across all classes, across all industries, and of no industry at all. A lot of unemployed people who decide that they are going to volunteer to try and keep the country functioning during this strike. For example, of the special constables that volunteered during this period, around 250,000 people signed up and said that they were willing to try and support this operation and keep the peace and make sure that the country stayed upright, for want of a better phrase. And so it's easy to try and make this seem almost as if there's a class war going on in Britain. And it's the working class who are on strike and it's the upper class who are against them. But really, I think what we're dealing with is something much closer to almost a form of civil war that cuts across class. Instead, you have members of the working class on strike and you have members of the working class helping to defeat the strike. And really, it is those people and their commitment and their effort that means that the general strike itself is almost doomed to fail.
Well, on the food point, I mean, food obviously is so important, more so than pretty much anything else, including even coal, especially in May. I think. I mean, if this had been the height of winter and you had the risk of people freezing to death, that would have added another layer to the strike. The communist leader, Robert Arnott, said at the time, "He who feeds the people wins the strike." And so many of those who were involved in the strike saw when the government was willing to drive literal tanks that they had last seen in the First World War down the streets of London to ensure that they could offload food from ships, they knew that this was a government that meant business. On your point about the volunteers, as they're euphemistically called, scabs is another word that's used for them. Blacklegs, it's another word, blacklegs, coming from a mining context, referring to those miners who crossed the picket lines, went into work, and you knew that they had crossed the picket lines because when you saw them later in the day, their legs were black from coal because they'd been kneeling down in the coal shafts. Whatever term you wish to use for them, yes, of course, there were many people who did get involved in that. There were people who were unemployed. There were working class people who got involved. But one of the things that's most notable about this strike is the remarkable unity of the trades unions and of the sort of labour movement. Many of these pits didn't even have to do picket lines because it would have been unthinkable for anyone in that workplace to undermine the strike, to go to work. And so in some pit villages, rather than waste their time on a picket line, they started to get involved in other kinds of activity, like forming barricades on the roads to try and prevent the road transport of goods in lorries and vans and cars. I think we should also say, as we wrap this up, that there were many members of the ruling class who saw the general strike as an opportunity to get involved in a form of class war. So you have these extraordinary stories of aristocrats who volunteer, undermine the general strike. Lady Mountbatten, previously Princess Louis of Battenberg, before her husband's title was removed during the First World War. Later, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, the last consort of a viceroy of India, worked the Daily Express switchboard. Prince Georgy Konstantinovich of Russia, cousin of the late Tsar, had become a special constable. The Earl of Meath, at the young age of 85, himself had become a special constable in Surrey. You had stories of, on the younger side of this, of young undergraduates from Oxford and Cambridge, many of them public school educated, who volunteered to undermine the strike in transport by volunteering to drive buses. Some of them had come from families where they had private automobiles, so they knew how to drive a car. So they thought, well, how difficult can it be to drive a bus if I know how to drive a car? They volunteered to, in some cases, to drive trains, an extraordinarily dangerous undertaking, which cost people their lives. There's one story I heard recently from the general strike where one of these amateur railway drivers clearly didn't understand basic safety procedures and had their heads stuck out the window of the engine car, and then the train went under a bridge and it took their head off. So this was, for some of them, being part of what the government called the Organisation of Maintenance Supplies, but basically an effort by the ruling class to undermine the general strike. For some, it was a form of entertainment. It was a bit of a jolly. It was a bit of a sort of way of dressing up in working class clothes, etc. But it also had very serious consequences, in some cases deadly consequences.
But if that was all there was, then the volunteers would have been insufficient to break the strike. It's a useful myth of the left to make out that this was a bunch of aristocrats and toffs, all rather jolly hockey sticks, having a bit of fun driving a bus for 9 days. I mean, it's really not the reality of the case, although of course there was some of that going on. As a slight aside, I really loathe this term scabs. I also think it's really inappropriately used in this case as well. I mean, is somebody really a scab if they're not in a job that's on strike, not even in an industry perhaps that's on strike, if they're not in a trade union that's called the strike, and they're volunteering to deliver food. I think it's outrageous to call them a scab. I really do.
Well, they're undermining the strike. That's the key thing.
Yeah, but it's not. I mean, sometimes
They're not showing their solidarity with the strike.
But what the guy would say, I often find this with trade unions. So you almost expect that when they go on strike, everybody else has to sort of lie down and wait to be defeated. No, that is obviously not the case. I mean, people, if the unions are causing these mass walkouts, people are entitled to try and resist in order to make sure that food supplies happen, that public transport operates, etc. The idea that there's something wrong or immoral about an ordinary member of the public who is not in any way affiliated to the sector or the unions that's on strike from assisting in the maintenance of good order in the nation, I actually think it's absurd to say there's anything wrong with that. These people are actually patriots.
They are undermining the ability of the organised working class to improve their conditions, to improve their pay, and to lead a better and approaching civilised life.
But like I say, with the best will in the world, what is that to somebody who is unemployed, isn't in any of these sectors, and suddenly finds that actually their life is being made worse?
Temporarily. We're talking about the long-term future of the working class.
I think we'll never agree on that, I'm afraid. But anyway, that brings to an end this first part of our two-part episode on the general strike. There's a lot more to discuss. We'll leave it at the point at which the strike has begun. Millions of people are striking. Hundreds of thousands of people are volunteering to try and break the strike. Some strikers say it's purely about their conditions down the mines. Others see it as a chance to try and bring about revolution. And so next time we'll be discussing what happens next. The role of the media, of the Labour Party, of Stanley Baldwin, of the royal family, and how this very British near-revolution comes to its end. That'll be out on Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.